Good morning. As I was preparing for today's talk, a song came to me, and I meant to call Ashley to request the song. But as you know, as things get away from you, I forgot to do that. And so the song that she picked was "Open My Eyes of My Heart" today. And it fits in perfectly with what I have to say. Just how the Lord works, I believe. But I'd like to thank Ashley. I don't know if she's already left before I speak, but I'd like to thank Ashley. She's one of the smart ones here. But today's theme is, "Whom shall I send?" These are the words of the prophet Isaiah one day as he was worshiping God in the temple. He heard these words from God. He said, "Whom shall I send?" Isaiah listened to these words, accepted the call, and became a prophet. Isaiah was a prophet who prophesied of the birth of Jesus 700 years before Jesus was even born. But first, before I talk about that, I'd like to talk about, we have friends today who are visiting for the first time from the Columbus congregation. I see a few from the Columbus congregation, but I've heard there's going to be quite a few more coming. Hopefully there'll be quite a few more coming from the Columbus congregation. This is an historic day for us, as last week was a historic day for them. Last week they had their final service in their building at the Columbus congregation. That building is over 100 years old. Kathy and I had the privilege to attend their 100th anniversary about 4 or 5 years ago, and I learned a little bit about the North congregation, things I hadn't known before, but I'd like to welcome them. I know if you remember when we sold our church building looked almost exactly like the North Church building when we were on the south side of Columbus. But when we sold our building and moved here to Grove City, it was a depressing situation for many people. And I know I was depressed because of the facility. I had so many good experiences in that facility. And some people, it was the only congregation or church building they'd ever attended. And so it was depressing. So I'm sure people from the North congregation are in a period of mourning at this time. And I was thinking about that and praying about what I should say. And these words come to me: "I will not leave you as orphans." You heard that before? "I will not leave you as orphans." It comes from John, the 16th chapter. I looked it up, or 14th chapter. And the words are, "If you love me, keep my commands, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to help you and be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. The world cannot accept him because it neither sees him nor knows him, but you know him, for he lives with you and will be with you. I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you." So I hope you feel welcome here today. I hope you don't feel like a stranger. I hope you don't feel like an orphan. And on the other hand, I hope our congregation is very welcoming and inclusive with you. I know there's quite a few youth that come in your congregation. I hope we can go out of our way to welcome the young people in your congregation. A couple of years ago in one of our vision meetings, Craig asked me about our congregation's history. So one of the first things I did was I went back to some history files. Bob and Lucinda Madden, some of the people here don't remember them, but they'd given me a lot of information over the years, a lot of things, and there's some stuff stored here at church. So I went into the past history of our church, and I found some very interesting things that I didn't know. And one of the things I found out, the North Sound congregation, the old North Columbus congregation, it was the first church in this area, and it started in the late 1900s. And I found the history. Bob Madden had written the history, or Lucinda Madden had written the history of the beginnings of our church in 1969, and I read that, and then she had another article about a person named Hosea Matthews. He's the one. Have you ever heard that name, Hosea Matthews? I hadn't heard the name before. I think I had heard it a few times in Southern Ohio because he preached in Southern Ohio, but he was the one that started the work in the late 1900s. or 1800s. And in 1900, he was preaching on the street corners of Columbus. That's how he started. And I guess he had a really deep voice, was a great singer in the choir. He started preaching on the street corners in Columbus. And Lucinda wrote that he was a powerful minister. If you want to know who I'm talking about, we keep this picture in the back pastor's office. That's Bob and Lucinda. Bob and Lucinda Madden, who were powerful forces in our church for a long time. But she wrote the history in '69. Bob followed up with another history in 1979. And but from then on, there wasn't really a history of our congregation. I've been attempting the last couple of years to write the history, stuff that since then, from '79 on. But what I found out reading their history was about Hosea Matthews. Well, first, getting a little ahead of myself, but there was a Danish philosopher, Søren Kierkegaard, once wrote, "Life can only be understood backwards, but must be lived forwards." To understand life, we need to understand the history of our congregation, I think. If we take a few minutes to look backwards, we might be able to understand what is going on now in our two congregations as they merge once again. And again, I say once again, because I found out some things that you might be interested in also. And you might be able to see God's hand in the work. And then Lucinda wrote a tribute to Hosea Matthews. And she talked about he was born in 1861. He was ordained in about 1887, I believe. He came to Columbus and started preaching on the street corners in the late 1800s. Early 1900s. Lucinda's mom and dad were baptized in 1903, and she said he was a human dynamo. He even traveled southern Ohio. I can remember stories of him in southern Ohio, and he went to the Portland Racine congregation one time in the Depression. If you remember Portland Racine, that's where one of our former pastors, Jeff Donahue, was from there. Grace Prophet was from there, and so was Lynn Reese, Grace's daughter Lynn. They were from the Racine area, almost the southernmost part of Ohio, and they were in the midst of their Great Depression. Hosea Matthews was prophesying. He said that the Lord would be with them, and out of these grounds will flow riches. Well, it was they didn't think too much about that at the time because it was very rich, fertile country right along the river ground, and you hear about southern Ohio fruit and vegetables, you see that sold. That's where the Racine area, right along the river. And they used to send, every year they'd send vegetables. Those people from Racine would send vegetables to Camp for Camp. You remember that day eating the vegetables they sent to camp? And they continued that tradition for many, many years, sending there. And I remember one year we didn't have any meat and all we ate was fruit and vegetables. I think it was all from the Racine congregation. One time we might have had a cheese sandwich with a tomato on it, but there was no meat all week, but a lot of that food came from there. But he prophesied, out of these grounds will flow riches. And they thought he was talking about food. Well, a few years later, some of the church members discovered oil, and they became fairly wealthy, these people did, and they realized that was a prophecy that he had given. But he started the church here, and by the time he died in 1957, there were 3 churches in Columbus with 700 members. Our church started about 100 years ago this year eventually, but what happened before that is very interesting. South Congregation started out in 1909. They met on Hosack Street. By the way, I was going to ask Joe, do you remember Brother Matthews? Don't remember him. I thought you might, or somebody. I thought you were Betty, but no one to remember him. But anyway, they started in 1909 as a small mission. And then in 1916, they built a small frame building. They had about 60 members. And in 1920, they started growing, and they decided to build a new building. So from 1920 to 1922, they moved back up north to the North Congregation, what we call Columbus South. Now they moved there, and they met there for 2 years until 1922. 100 years ago today, our 2 congregations were meeting, and now we're reunited exactly 100 years later. While the church on the south side was being built, Lucinda's father financed the church. He had only one stipulation, that he would be the treasurer. He was a store owner and the treasurer, and they told Lucinda she couldn't go to college. Women are supposed to work. She's supposed to work in the store. Well, she didn't buy that at all. She started working for an attorney, became a paralegal, and then she went to law school, and she became one of the few women in the state of Ohio attorneys, and she was pretty tough. She could be really tough. And she was choir director for over 40 years. She taught Sunday school for 60, maybe 70 years. She even had a girls' basketball team that she coached. And I knew some of the people. Joe's Aunt Ruth played on her basketball team. I knew there was quite a few of Margaret Barker, but she was Bob and Lucinda. They were their role models. You know, I think Margaret Barker became a doctor. But most of the ones that played basketball and had opportunities for higher education, not only did she encourage it, she helped finance quite a few people. And I know a guy that, Mike Whitehead, he was in school in Columbus, went to Capitol. He asked her to help him out once, and she said, well, come over to my office and we'll see what we can do. She drew up a legal contract and with payment terms and everything. And he said, you knew that you had to pay it, you'd be in trouble. So she gave him a little advice too, but they always supported young people. They were very involved with young people. And they believed in sports, they believed in education. Bob actually ran track at Ohio State. I've got a picture in one of the files here that he was running track at Ohio State, and then he became pastor later on. But they were squeaky tight with their own money. One time Lucinda was in the hospital, and you had to pay an extra $1 a day to get the TV. She said, I'm not paying $1 a day for that's ridiculous. But I think they each only had one or two pair of clothes, but they gave millions of dollars to people. They supported. I don't think we would ever have even started building Camp Bountiful without Bob and Lucinda. Of course, they supported the church. They were benefactors of Graceland College at the time, Graceland University. Just anyone that needed money, it seems like they always went to Bob and Lucinda. And the World Church recognized that. In fact, at Lucinda's funeral, the president of Graceland College, an apostle from the church, president of Graceland College, came to her funeral. So they were highly recognized. And if you remember, Lucinda was a presence. In the congregation, she was a presence at World Church. She had sat up front, in front of the president of the church, if anyone remember going to World Conference. And while 6,000 delegates were trying to get attention to get on the floor to speak, Lucinda had her knitting. There was knitting, and all of a sudden she'd raise her hand. They said, Lucinda, do you have anything to say? So she was a presence anywhere she went. She was even pictured. In the Herald in 1986 was her picture and an article about her, how she became to be an attorney. They traveled all over the world. When they came back, they took slides. And one of the biggest events that I remember, I've gone to some of those too. They'd take slides and show a president. Nobody else had traveled. And I think Lucinda had been to every country except for China at one time. She ended up going to China out with Bob, but after he died, she went with her niece. But anyway, they were powerful influence and role models in our congregation. Bob was a meticulous record keeper, and somewhere I've got his records. He got mad at Joe one time because Joe mowed his grass. He kept a record. He had a notebook of how high he mowed the grass each week. And he got mad at Joe one time because Joe didn't mow in the lines. You remember that, Joe? But anyway, he has a record of his activities, priesthood activities from 1930 to 1983. He died in 1984. And some amazing statistics. He had 14 columns of ministry. One was priesthood visits, hospital visits, over 4,000. 4,000, he did like 80 weddings, 80 funerals, all kinds of numbers here that he had, but he kept meticulous records over the years, and then about 1970, he summarized it, because I think he thought he was dying then, but then he started up again and did it again. But anyway, they heard the voice, like Hosea Matthews. They heard that voice, whom shall I send? And they answered the call. So let's fast forward to about 10 or 11 years ago, when our congregation was on Sullivan Avenue and I think Hawk Street or Souder. We were meeting down there, taking a meal once a month to the mission. I forget the name of it now, but once a month we were taking a meal. Sandy Denny got us involved in that, taking a meal to the area one time a month. And the pastor name was Joe Johnson. And Joe Johnson was over 90 at the time. So we worked with him. In fact, he told me once, Sandy led the ministry, but we had other people involved and spoke from time to time. We had worship service after the dinner. And he told me one time, he said, I like your group better than any other. A lot of the churches come in, provide the food, and then leave. He said, Art, you get involved with the people here. We were his favorite group. But then an administrator came in one time. He found out who we were, and he said, you got to leave. We were no longer welcome there. So we were kicked out, and that was depressing. I remember we were all kind of surprised and depressed. All we were trying to do was help people. But then not long afterwards, I was at a pastor's meeting at the Columbus congregation. Dave Yoder and I sat beside each other. I started looking around, and I noticed that this looks a lot like where we were serving before. And David told me that Dick and Shirley has already offered ministry there, they had a food pantry, a clothes pantry. There's already offering community ministry, and we talked about that. He said, well, you might want to talk to them. So remember, we had Sandy and a few others, and Dick and Shirley were there, and we decided to try that, and we did it for, I think, 8 or 9 years. Sandy led the ministry at first, and then I think Betty took over for a year. Betty Gilmer took over for a few years. And then Ruth took over for a few years. But anyway, we worked closely with Dick and Shirley. We got to know a lot of the members of the North Congregation. So it's not like we don't know each other now. But I think the Lord had a hand in that ministry, preparing us for the time when we would be able to worship together as one once again. But anyway, Dick, when I found out Sandy and Ruth and Betty were the leaders then, and now you come back down here to Columbus, and our pastors are Ruth and Sandy. So it's kind of interesting, I thought, how the Lord works. In our adult class, we've been studying the book Life Beyond Amazing by Dr. David Jeremiah, and he talks about compassion. And he talks about the story of the Good Samaritan. By the way, Dick and Shirley are compassionate. Betty teaches the adult class now. Sandy and Ruth, there's one thing they have in common. They're all very compassionate people. But anyway, the story of the Good Samaritan that Jesus told, he said, one occasion an expert in the law stood up to Jesus, and he said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus said, how do you read it? He answered, love your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. So on one occasion, the expert again stood up and said, what must I do? I've got this twice, I'm sorry. And he said, you've answered correctly. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself, and he said, who is my neighbor? So Jesus told the parable. A man was going down to Jerusalem, from Jerusalem to Jericho. And believe parables have a scriptural truth in it, but they're not always exactly what you call truth, most of them. But I think this parable might be the most true parable that I can think of, because I think Jesus probably saw this happening before several times, because he traveled on that road to Jericho. He said, a man went going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. When he was attacked by robbers, they stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, and a Levite is an assistant to the priest. And what they did, I think when maybe every year they'd go for 2 weeks to the temple. They'd take off their work. They'd go from Jericho, which was a tough road, uphill and downhill. But Jesus traveled that road also. So the Levite came, he saw by him, passed on the other side. But a Samaritan, who were people that were rejected by Jewish people, looked down upon by the Jews, he went to him, bandaged his wound, poured on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey and brought him to the inn and took care of him. The next day he took 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after them, he said. Look after him, he said. When I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you have. Which of the 3 was the neighbor? Jesus said. And the expert replied, the one who had mercy on him, or the one who had compassion on him. Charles Swindoll, which some of you might be familiar with, I think he still preaches on TV some. He tells a story about students in an evangelistic seminary were given the assignment of studying the story of the Good Samaritan and to do an in-depth analysis and a study on that. While most of them did a perfect study and everything, there were 3 other guys that decided, hey, we're going to put this to practical use. So what they did, one person volunteered to be the victim. They tore his shirt, poured mud and ketchup on his wounds so they couldn't tell who he was. They placed him near the path from the dormitory to the classroom, writhing in pain. While the students walked by around him and made comments to him, not one of the seminary students who passed by stopped to offer help. No one was compassionate to him. No one acted. Although their academic work was flawless, they did not act on it. So Dr. Jeremiah says, to have compassion, you must act on it. In short, he says, compassion is what you see, what you do, and how you do it. Compassion is not analytical. And if you stop to think about it, you'll be thinking of all these things I got to do. He says, it's not analytical. Analytical won't do the job. He said, compassion involves risk, involves being interrupted. And I know many times I've passed on the other side because I felt I had more important things to do. So it's not, it's being allowed to be interrupted. Compassion involves sacrifice. It involves courage. It involves yielding to the Holy Spirit. Involves giving up control. I added that myself, giving up control. We always want control over our lives, but compassion involves giving up control. Compassion involves being vulnerable. Above all, Jesus was compassionate. He was compassionate to the bruised and brokenhearted. He was compassionate toward the sick. He was compassionate toward the hungry. He was compassionate toward the widows and the orphans. He befriended social rejects. He healed lepers and blind. He wasn't afraid to touch them. He loved the children and blessed them. His last act was to forgive his murderers. We can see things and have sympathy. We can listen and have empathy. But if we help them, we have compassion. It's what we do. The story of the Good Samaritan reminds us that our greatest calling is not to be involved in church activities like the priest and the Levite. Perhaps our greatest calling is to be compassionate like Jesus was. It's not what we are, what we think we are, president, vice president, officer, and become. It's not what we are, it's who we are. It's who we are. God looks upon us as who we are. So when we hear the voice of God saying, like Isaiah heard the voice, whom shall I send? We can respond like Isaiah and say, here am I, send me.